Hey everyone, welcome back to AI Insights. I'm your host for today, Fleur Prince, and we're having a new guest here on the show. We're being joined by Paulina Guerrero. She's an international lawyer and compliance officer. Welcome, Paulina.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's so awesome that you offered to come on the show. It's really awesome. We met a few months ago through a mutual friend, and I really love to hear more about what you do. So tell our audience a bit more who you are and what you do.
In mostly general terms, I am a lawyer by profession. So I am originally from Mexico. That's where I grew up, and I went to law school there. So I did my bachelor's in law. I mostly focused my career on international law, and then at the same time, I also worked for the private sector, particularly the banking sector. So I did both of those things. As I was doing my bachelor's degree, I did some studies abroad here in Europe and some internships, both in government institutions and private institutions, and that continued all the way after I finished my degree. So I worked as a head of the legal department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. And then I also worked as a compliance officer in HSBC Bank at the global division. We had a global division, and I was in charge of having regulatory compliance across the region of Latin America, while I was also working with other regions as well within the bank. And now I am in the Netherlands. That's how I met Fleur. And so I did a master's in international law, public international law, at Lada University. And I have also, during that master's, that was very essential to my own specialization as an international lawyer. And that also, ironically, somehow took me back to the whole compliance thing and how it involves the banking sector and cybersecurity. All of these things happen to be very intertwined. So it's been fascinating to be able to connect them.
Yeah, that's quite a career path already. How old are you actually? Sorry, I'm just asking you for
I'm
our
30.
audience as well, because it's quite the path. You're 20?
I'm 30.
Oh, 30. Oh my God.
Yes.
That's quite the
Thank
career
you.
path. No, I think it's really cool because you have like a really awesome, unique background. I mean, spanning all the way from international law, regulatory compliance, and now also cybersecurity, and as you told me, with an interest in AI. Could you tell us a bit more, like what sparked your interest in the intersection of technology and law?
Well, so it actually did start when I was still doing my bachelor's. So at the time I was basically a law student, but I was working, doing an internship at our National Bank for Foreign Trade. We had at the time a national bank that was in charge of that, basically to encourage foreign investment in Mexico. So I was doing my internship there while I was studying. I was technically in the legal department of that bank. But part of our, training was to take, for example, courses that involved cybersecurity issues. Banks tend to have that as a very important thing for them to train their employees in things. Sometimes it can be, very basic knowledge of cybersecurity. So we talk about malwares and we talk about phishing. And we talk about lots of scams that basically most people can fall into. So as part of my training, I had to take those courses. And I thought at the beginning, well, this is interesting. And then while taking these courses on, how to basically, as a bank employee, how to be able to notice phishing, how to be able to catch it when it happens, when you receive phishing, when it's a malware, when you click on a link, how does that work? How they take all your information and all of that. So it started by taking those courses, and then I started reading on my own, and then I read all these stories online about people, regular people, not just who have a bank account and they use it, but basically anyone uses the internet, and we all have our information there, whether it's with a bank or with a social media, anything basically, and our picture is in it and our name is in it, etc. And then I started reading all these, horror stories, honestly, on how many people had been scammed, or many people, they took their money or they took something else because they fell into some fraudster. And I thought that was very interesting. And as a law student, then I thought, are there no regulations, basically to stop this? Because we learned, in law school, you learn fraud as a crime. In most countries, it is codified as a crime. But then sometimes those regulations kind of fall behind with all these technological advancements. Because one thing I did notice at the time when I was a student and I was reading about all these people all over the world who had been scammed in some way, for example, I thought, well, there is a jurisdiction issue here because then let's say the person who scammed you online is not in your country. So
No,
then under
yeah.
which authority are you going to go and sue them? So that was kind of like how it began. And then I started, I saw it working in the banking industry. And then as I was doing my master's, and I also kind of like saw the way it was also related unexpectedly to international law in a different way.
Yeah. Oh my God, I really love how you talk about that because you also so when I was also looking online, I saw you also have experience with I hope I'm saying it right HSBC in regulatory compliance and now working as a cybersecurity analyst at GNOW. Has your perspective like on financial regulations evolved because of this as well?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I think there is still the jurisdiction issue that I mentioned. I mean, we're
Mm-hmm.
still quite over that problem, but there are significant advances made in the past couple of years. It also depends on the country where you're in. So in my experience, because I had to analyze both when I was working in the bank and now basically I have to analyze a lot of regulations that are not from my jurisdiction. So for example, when I was working at HSBC Bank, because I was in charge of, basically more than one country, even though I was a lawyer under the Mexican jurisdiction, sometimes I also had to look at laws that were not from my country, and sometimes they were not in my language. But it was very interesting in the way that you see, oh, how does this country, for example, manage this kind of issue, especially for terms of both cybersecurity. In my case, it was mostly focused for financial crimes. So there are all these ways of committing financial crimes right now online, basically. So that makes it more difficult to track down for things like money laundering and tax evasion. So there are many ways to get around the laws. There are still some gaps there to be filled, especially when the world is so globalized and you have maybe people living in one country, but they are committing financial crime or tax evasion in another one and they're doing it online. So how does a financial institution protect themselves, etc.? And under what laws do they do that? So in that sense, my perspective has not changed in the sense that I still see jurisdiction as an issue. But then on the other hand, I am also kind of happy to see how it's become a more important topic that now more people are starting to think about because it is the technological advance on one hand, and it is our job to adapt it basically, to adapt our regulations to this evolving environment. So yeah, it has changed in the sense that I now see it as maybe even more important than I did at the time. I may have, most of us, I think, may have underestimated it at the time.
Yeah, I think definitely also with the I want to say the evolvement of the internet, where pretty much like borders disappear. Yeah, you can see and I think especially with AI now, because I think a good example is that, for example, with Amazon, is that what used to be like I think like 10 million hacking attempts per year has now become per day, where they also have to evolve when it comes to cybersecurity. And indeed, in the involvement of law as well. Like, what do you do against when people are trying to hack you? How do you counter sue if you find out who tried to hack you? What do you do? What I also would want to ask you then about this as well is what do you think are actually the most promising applications of AI in regulatory compliance that you're seeing emerge that can actually be beneficial for people?
It's actually very promising, I think, mostly from the point of view of a compliance officer, or maybe that's because, in my personal experience, and I have worked with AI before in that role. So I can tell you that it was very important to use AI, or at least it was very helpful in a way. So when you are in the role of compliance for financial institutions and multinational financial institutions at that, like multinational banks, etc., if you think about the fact that, for example, a bank has to comply with the laws of every country it is in. So there is a bank, but if you have offices of that bank or headquarters, etc., in every other country, that has to comply with the laws of that country. And usually the consequences for non-compliance tend to fall into very expensive fines, huge fines to pay. So that's why the role of compliance, especially for financial institutions, tends to be so important. And if you think about the fact that as a compliance lawyer, you have to look at regulations from all these countries, basically, if you want to have a team that basically wants to, if you want them to look at the financial regulations of more countries within one region or basically the entire planet and work with each other, then it is very complicated if you have every single day laws are being published. If you go to the, let's say, to a website of any regulator, of any country in the world, every day, because that's what I did, and you check them, every single day they have new regulations. Some of them are not to do with your sector, but basically you have to check them. And then you have
they
to
could have an
analyze
effect.
them.
They could have doing.
It can have an effect on what you're doing. And at some point, it has become humanly very difficult to be able to keep track on all of them, because they come out and then, or sometimes a regulation that came out a year before, a year after can be changed, or they may have, changed a couple of things here and there, a couple of technicalities which are still important for your job that you have to be aware of, or at least you have to report to your stakeholders or to your business partners, hey, this is a new regulatory development that just came in that may impact our business, etc. So if you think about it, we used AI basically to help us in doing that. So it was mostly human intelligence, as I like to call it, in contact with AI, because we would use AI programs, for example, to help us track down, like identify and track down all financial regulations all over the world and be able to have, let's say, like a platform where we could have them, both, let's say, the type of regulation that it was, maybe an analysis, like maybe a summary, how it impacted our business, and we could constantly be checking it or use that to report it to other business partners for them to be aware of them as well. But you need to be very organized and very structured, and as I said, and have like a program or platform where you can keep all of this in. It doesn't mean that you don't need a human analysis, because for what I saw, AI helps a lot, but it's also not perfect. So especially in the legal profession, it does need a human to look at it. Sometimes there were regulations that the AI did not catch. And if it wasn't because the human lawyers would actually go to the regulator itself and see it, then maybe we would have never seen it, and, there would have been a consequence for that. Or there were also cases where maybe the summary was wrong, or the type of regulation, it didn't identify it correctly, so we as the humans changed that. There's always going to be maybe some little mistakes here and there that the human lawyer has to correct. We are the ones who have the legal analysis, the critical thinking skills. But I will be honest, it does save you a lot of time when you have AI, let's say, to help you in do all that. I think it's very promising in the area of compliance.
So you would definitely say that a human, like I think Marissa Borsboom had a very good name for it, human agent. That you would see that's important for especially your jobs, for there to be one between the AI and the eventual case. Cool. What you would also so what I also would want to ask about is your background that includes KYC procedures and due diligence. Like, how do you see AI transforming these processes, and what challenges remain on that part?
Yeah, so I do see AI being able to enhance the KYC processes, because normally without AI, this one, I know how it's done actually without AI, because it was like way before. When you do like a KYC process, so basically the human agent does have to look at, let's say, all the documents from a client, and then they have to make sure that every piece of information is right. Sometimes it can be, many people say, oh, it's so tedious. It has to be done, but it can be. So, very basic data, such as maybe the name or the address, or let's say they're giving you a contract, or they're giving you, the deeds to a property, and you have to, basically check that everything is as they say it is, and that it is, incorrect with the information that you have. So I do see AI being able to help in that regard. I do see maybe AI programs being able to have, for example, a profile on your clients, so that as an institution, you know who you are dealing with and you can carry out that KYC procedure. The only thing I see is that, first of all, then we do need like a very strong framework when it comes to data protection, because all institutions have. These institutions have information on their clients. And yes, it's part of their KYC procedure, but if we're going to use AI for that, then we also would need like a strong framework in the sense of how are we going to protect that data and make sure that it doesn't get leaked. And secondly, the same thing as with compliance, it does still need a human to look at it at the end of the day. So it's not really everything like so automatical, but it is only to enhance it. And it is, the human who does the whole critical thinking problem, and you check
Yeah.
the client and everything and say, okay, yeah, this is fine. Or maybe the AI program made a mistake, or, we're not going to then rely on AI for everything, because maybe under the AI program, maybe someone is, let's say, a very safe person, to open a bank account in your bank. But then if a person looks at it, then they say, this sounds like money laundering to me. So that's why I think it's important to combine the two. But yeah, I definitely see it enhancing KYC processes as well.
Are there any, by the way, favorite AI tools that you would say you would recommend to people for them to use when it comes to the KYC process?
Actually, it depends, because the one I have, for example, more experience with, I think was one that was called a Rapid Tools, but that one was mostly used for compliance. You can use it for KYC processes. And again, I'm sure, it's become more developed over time, but at the time it did make its mistakes, and that's why we still needed the human lawyers, but it did save a lot of time. So I would say that one. I know there are more that are being developed specifically for either financial institutions or for, let's say, for the legal work. I know that here in the Netherlands, actually, we have Ledger, who has been developing a new AI tool for lawyers to use. So I would say those two seem to be promising in my personal experience.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. I think very much for our audience, everyone who is indeed in law, I would say definitely go check out those two. And what I would also want to ask for you as well, I think this would be a good question because you also now transferred like from lawyer to, I would say, cybersecurity analyst. Can you tell a bit more like how you ended up going into that role?
So basically, most people wouldn't think about it. Cybersecurity does have to do with the legal profession, in the sense that on the one hand, there is the criticism that I myself agree with this criticism that, usually as lawyers, we are very far ahead in terms of all these kind of regulatory and ethical debates, but sometimes far behind in technological advancements. There comes a point where you cannot ignore that anymore. So yeah, I saw it. Yeah, first of all, as I said, when I was still studying and I was taking these courses and reading about online scams and stuff, and part of me thought, okay, what about regulations? Why are we not addressing this from a legal perspective? So that was, one inclination, let's say, or one thing that I thought, this is not right in a way. And then as I continued with my career, not just when I worked in the bank, because also when you work in banking institutions as, let's say, compliance officers, you do see a lot of regulations that have to do with cybersecurity in terms of, let's say, data protection, in terms of financial crime, as I said, like anti-money laundering or tax evasion, etc. So all of these things, and that reading all these regulations kind of makes you notice the way in which it's very easy right now to do things from the cyberspace, because as you said, basically borders are erased, by that.
Yeah.
I knew that, and especially for money laundering purposes, it's made it a lot more difficult to track down, if you're a financial institution. So then you read that and you start getting, more interested in that as a lawyer, because it seems like a very promising area that for many years we didn't address, or not as much as we had to, and then suddenly it became so evolved that you cannot ignore it anymore. So yeah, as a lawyer, I was always interested in, what is more innovative in that regard, and I always said we have to adapt to the changing circumstances. Even as lawyers, they always tell you, you always have to continue looking at new regulations because they always come out. You have to stay updated. And this is part of staying updated, taking into account this. And so I found it very interesting, especially for criminal law purposes, to look at cybersecurity, how to regulate it, how to prosecute it, how to enforce it, etc.
That's so interesting. It really reminds me of the TV show, like The Edge of Night, where Mike Carr and his colleague like solve crimes. I'm kind of getting
Watch
kind of that
it.
vibe.
It's very interesting.
I would definitely recommend watching it. It's super interesting. I will send you the link later after the podcast. But it's also very, I'm not trying to say interesting too many times, but the way you evolve from international law going into cybersecurity,
Yeah, yeah.
purely because of your personal interest in it and actually creating a job out of it.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with, yeah, sure, what you're passionate about. And when we talk about, transferring from one area to another, we talk a lot about transferring skills, or transferable skills. So the skills that I develop as a lawyer, which in my personal experience have been, I had to become very organized, very analytical, and I actually took joy in developing and enhancing those skills. And cybersecurity is another area where basically people have to be very analytical and you have to be very organized in nature. And it is a very serious area. So that kind of also went with my own personality. And so you mix the two, you mix what you become eventually passionate about with the skills that you already have, and you can transfer them from one area to another. And I like to see a lot on how many people have been doing that. It's very inspiring, I think.
Yeah, but also definitely hearing your story, how you were able to transfer these skills to this new area. Because I think when looking at myself, like I am, well, kind of organized, but I would definitely, I think, especially when you talk about indeed cybersecurity, you have to be super organized because you also have, yeah, you're responsible for collecting data, which also can be used in crime cases. By the way, on this topic, I actually saw that you developed a thesis on espionage, cybersecurity, and international law. I always dive deep on topics when I'm finding guests. So I was actually wondering, like, how are these topics converging with the advancements of AI technologies?
So basically, when I wrote my thesis, I was interested in the espionage for security purposes because that was a jump, actually, that is the public sector. So basically, when we talk about that, because it was public or international law, then we don't talk about financial institutions, we don't talk about companies, we talk about the public sector, basically. So we talk about countries, we talk about governments and how they interact with each other. And the fact that I saw that there was kind of like a legal gap when it comes to peacetime espionage in particular, because that there was wartime espionage in the Hague Conventions, but then I saw, okay, but during peacetime, and there has been historically recorded that there has been a lot of espionage, especially during the Cold War, which for many people it was not like an armed conflict in the traditional sense. It was, some authors will argue it was more of an intelligence war, let's say, between the East and the West. And so I mainly focused on that for my thesis. So this was actually before cybersecurity issues because they didn't have the technology to do that. It was mostly human intelligence. So it was through covert operations and physically sending agents to the site and to gather information. They also started developing some, especially like during the Second World War and maybe after, developing some coding machines, and some technologies to be able to codify messages and be able to intercept those communications. All of that basically took us to where we are today. So I thought, maybe I should go back to the basics because this was mostly like an academic research, that you're supposed to enjoy, for my enjoyment. So I thought, okay, I'm interested in the security issues because at the end of the day, for many people, it is a security threat to be able to intercept someone's information. So I thought, okay, so I decided to address, that legal gap that was there for espionage, but mostly focusing on a time in which we didn't have all that technology yet, but they were just starting to develop it because international law fell really far behind. Because if this is how they did it, let's say in the 1960s, then how do you think they do it now? Now with cybersecurity, there's like amazing books on cyber espionage. Like I would recommend them, very interesting sources because I think.
Do you have a book that you would recommend, you would say people have to read?
So Buchanan is one author that I read. Is also, the book is called Cyber Espionage and International Law. That I think explains everything. Someone who had not read much about specifically cyber espionage, I think it explains it very well. And then it takes us to the other point that you mentioned about AI, because if you have all these espionage techniques that have been advancing now with new advancing technologies, that means that espionage went from being a human intelligence issue for the most part and, covered operations, sending agents physically to the site.
Sending physically people there.
Yes, and now you have, all the movies that I'm sure everyone has watched and they're very
Yeah,
interesting. They makes it
James
look a lot
Bond,
more,
you
yeah,
name it.
it makes espionage look, I think, a lot more glamorous than it actually is,
Yeah, I
probably.
mean, besides yeah, everything that comes with it.
But the agencies are real. The agencies that they
Yeah,
mention are actually real and they are actually government divisions. But if they evolved from that to cyber espionage but cyber espionage at the end of the day, so far we understand it's made by humans in another
hmm
country, you know, hacking into government sites, for example. But now, how does AI come into play? So that is another thing that then I think basically international law fell really far behind. You can now do that, let's say, with AI. Sometimes maybe someone can, develop an AI program to be able to professionally hack. I'm sure it has been done before in other sectors, so it is concerning how it can do now. I think it's definitely a way in which you wouldn't think, or most people I think wouldn't think that AI and cybersecurity are related to international law and espionage, but they are, especially these days, and we're seeing it more now.
Do you also see it with, so we recently learned that, for example, AI agents have now become publicly available. Would you say you've seen a rise in that as well when it comes to cybersecurity hacking attempts where these agents are autonomously hacking, you name it,
Personally,
companies?
I've seen it more now with still humans doing it. And especially because I've seen more about basically what we know for maybe automatic hacking is that sometimes there is this method that actually came a couple of maybe years ago that when we think about, for example, implanting malwares into, an
hmm
equipment, we normally think of, let's say, someone sending you a link because that's how they used to do it before. A person would send you an email and the email would have a link. And then if you open the link, then basically it stole all your data from your equipment. But now, for what we've seen, a single hacker can actually hack a lot of equipments in one area, especially like equipments which are somehow related to one another. So, for example, because they belong to the same organization, to the same company, they can implant like one bug on one, and that can steal the information from all of them. Like that can be possible. So, at the end of the day, it is still done by one person, but these kinds of technologies make it easier for that one person to steal the information of many equipments at the same time. So that's how I have personally learned it happens.
That is actually pretty interesting when it comes to the fact, because I think most people would think indeed that AI agents are now mostly hacking, but to actually hear that it's still mostly human related definitely might change the perspective of people also listening to the podcast. But by the way, do you also see like cultural and regional differences when it comes to the impact of global AI governance efforts right now as an international lawyer?
Yeah, actually, I think some countries have started tackling the issue earlier than others. For
hmm
example, so actually, and you see how when each country comes with their different type of regulations. So, for example, I've looked at European Union regulations, which are actually, I think, some of the strongest ones, I would say. So we have basically you have in these European regulations, you have, for example, DORA, which came out fairly recently.
hmm
You have the GDPR that actually came all the way back, I think, in 2016, if I remember correctly. That was mostly to be able to protect data of users. Curiously, at the same time, for example, Mexico came up with its own laws. So then around the same time, which are very similar, if you compare the GDPR to Mexico's law, for example, they do have very similar provisions, and those are mostly to protect data from basically particulars. So in Mexico, it's called like a general law for the protection of data in possession of particulars. So all the companies and etc., like private institutions that have your data, you can use that law against them. Similar and around the same time as the GDPR. But then when these kind of more technological advances started coming, and I think that's when some countries started or some regions started lagging behind. So basically, like the European Union started coming with more regulations. So there's also NIS2, the Network and Information Security Directive, to basically strengthen cyber resilience across the EU, DORA, as I mentioned before, also the Cyber Resilience Act, like, a lot about emphasis on that, on cyber resilience, because they have been noticing how prevention, for the most part, tends to be essential before there is, a disaster coming. US regulations are more sometimes focused on particular sectors. And in Latin America, I see that maybe they had a harder time coming to terms about it because, as I said, as a Mexican lawyer, these are things that we didn't really see before. But then as we started becoming a lot more technologically savvy, because now we have digital banks there as well. And actually, many years ago, we came up with a fintech law as well, to regulate the fintechs and cryptocurrency and all that. Like we tended to very updated in those topics. So we started having, coming up with these new regulations. But then it was, that maybe it was only people who were in that sector who were looking at them. And I'm talking about maybe 6 years ago. And then we're starting to actually get there and, receiving more multinational companies, etc. It's become, a lot more important than ever to tackle these issues. So I have seen these cultural differences mostly in the timing in which this region or this country has started to come up with these regulations. Maybe countries that were used to this type of problems before regulated them before, and then some countries eventually, they get there, just maybe a bit later. And they take a lot of inspiration. I see that a lot of similarities is because countries do tend to take inspiration from one another when they are drafting
Yeah.
their laws.
But you would definitely say because like on how the sector develops in a country, the laws also adapt to it pretty
Yes.
quickly. Awesome. Thanks for also providing the example of your own background in this. And also that you saw how this compliance evolved over depending on the development of the industry in certain countries. This might be a confrontational question when it comes to the development between building AI and regulating it.
Yes.
Because often there's the opinion that because AI is being more regulated now, you see that innovation stops. What would be your personal opinion on this?
Yeah, I think that has always been a debate, and you would be surprised that it didn't start with AI. Like, I have seen, that debate of, the more regulation, the less freedom to innovate, even when it comes to something as simple as opening businesses, and this was like before AI. So normally, because I grew up in Latin America, and we would have there a lot of these, debates and talks about how, we're not really supporting small businesses, we're not really supporting innovations, startups, etc., because the more a country wants to regulate and control these issues, the less freedom it gives for people to come up with something new. That has been, I could say that maybe it's a discussion that has been going on for maybe 10 years, perhaps even more. I just, I was much younger than before, so
Yeah.
I didn't really hear them happening. Only when I started my career that I started, listening to all these talks. And I said, basically, as a country, if you want to have certain freedom of the market, and that eventually will involve, innovating with AI, on the one hand, you do have to be very careful when it comes to how you're going to regulate it, because you don't want to give it, let's say, more power than it should, because there is all these risks that people associate normally with AI, especially in terms of data protection, in terms of cybercrime, etc. So on the one hand, you have that, and I understand why regulators kind of want to be very careful about that, because especially if you don't understand something very well, you tend to be afraid of it. So if you don't understand very well how AI works, then that means that you're going to be, as a regulator, I understand you're going to be afraid of it, and you're going to have very cautious perspective on it, because you say, okay, we don't want to give it more power than we should, because we don't want it to basically, let's say, be able to hack or be able to overtake us, in the sense that we're feeding it with all of this information, and then, we want to still be able to control it somehow. But then on the other hand, we see all these ways in which you can use it, and all these people coming with brilliant ideas, honestly, on what to use it for. So I think a balance is needed, but for that balance, we need both the regulatory or the legal, critical thinking, but we also need to have like the open dialogue to people who know how AI works, to be able to understand it better. I think that part of education is essential to be able to strike that balance and maybe have the freedom, but still, not in a dangerous way.
Yeah, so for them really to have a voice when it comes to when making these laws. Oh, that's actually a pretty good point that you're making. So we're now moving on to closing thoughts. So for that, also I actually want to come to the next question, because as we look toward the future, like what skills do you think legal and finance professionals need to develop to stay relevant in the new AI driven world, as I say?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for instance, I think we have to become a bit more technologically savvy. It's
Mhm.
no longer a skill only reserved for IT people or software engineers. It's all of us are using it now. So I do think that it should be part of education, starting from universities to become this technologically savvy to learn, about these things and all these new developments. It is a skill that we have to start building. Basically, in my personal experience, the universities were not doing that only a couple of years ago, and most of us learned them through experience. Most of us learned them when we actually went out into the real world and started working and seeing how things happen outside of a classroom, and then we started developing those skills. But I think things
Yeah,
have
but usually then it's kind of too late as well.
yeah, I mean, it wasn't too late for me personally because I mean, I was still, fairly young, fresh out of the
Mhm.
university, so it happened. But I know, people who are maybe from older generations who essentially didn't never saw it. For example, I had when it was a very, I'm gonna give you a very silly example, but to this day, sometimes I still think about it now that I'm working with into AI and technology and stuff.
Mhm.
When I was, in law school, and this was maybe, a couple of years ago back home, and, technology that is supposed to enhance your life. So obviously, most of us, like good millennials, we would come to class with our laptops because most of us already grew up in a digital area, and we grew up in a generation where it was very common to go to school and have a computer and be
Mhm.
able to take notes, etc. And in the middle of a university, we would have a professor to say, yeah, no, you cannot use your laptops to take class, to take notes in this class
Mhm.
because I don't want you getting distracted. And I was like, we're 20 years old. Why are you policing where we get distracted or not in class? Like that's, our issue. Basically his class was entirely, having us write by hand, like medieval monks, and
Wait.
yes, writing everything. And I thought, that's ridiculous because you're supposed to use these things and then they help you study and all of that. So I mean, it's not taking the notes for you; you're still taking them. But
Yeah.
those
Thankfully,
lawyers
the AI that can do that.
now we have that. But those lawyers are the ones actually who start lagging behind and they stay behind in that thing because they're not willing to evolve in that sense. So it's been really sad to watch. But then on the other hand, it is a skill that I think most of us who already belong to that generation and younger
Mhm.
generations, have just been able to develop perhaps with more ease, So you have to be technologically savvy. I'm not saying you have to be an expert because sometimes we're not going to be as experts as someone who is actually a professional in
Mhm.
terms of IT, in terms of, let's say, a software engineer or a programmer, etc. Like, I'm not saying that all of us are going to be as experts, but at the very least, we know how to use it and we have, these basic skills. And I think another two skills that I can think of is you have to be still, you have to keep your analytical and critical thinking skills. I think that is always going to be essential, even if you have AI working with you. It's still not going to be perfect. You're going to use it. It might save you time. It might, help you a lot in your job. But at the end of the day, we cannot leave aside, in my opinion, this human critical thinking skill. I think it's an amazing skill that as human beings we have, contrary to any other
No,
species.
definitely.
And we have to use it. And given how globalized everything has become, I think an international perspective is also essential. We cannot stay, we do not afford the luxury that maybe previous generations could have of only staying, within our square, within our own jurisdiction,
Yeah. Well, we studied.
our city. At the end of the day, we're all constantly interacting with each other. So I think having a global perspective on things, it opens your eyes a lot when you see the whole picture. And yeah, I think that's also the third most important skill that I would say.
And based on that advice, what would you say is actually the current like project or research in AI law that you are like most excited about, or and where do you hope to contribute in the coming years for final thought?
So I personally like the way how, when we talked about AI developments in terms of cybersecurity and cyber
Mhm.
and all that, because as we said, so far we have learned that sometimes, it is a human initiating those processes, but I'm very curious to see how they are starting to now use AI for that.
Yeah.
And so personally, as a lawyer, I find it fascinating. I like to contribute in the sense of, using my analytical skills to say, okay, to learn how it works first and then say, how can we tackle this? How can
Hmm.
we protect either financial institutions or protect governments or people in general from this? Because it's basically, it becomes like like the viruses, you can't see them, you can hardly fight them. So it it's fascinating, I think, how this has been developed for the purposes of cybersecurity and cyber espionage. So I want to see where this is going beforehand and then be able to analyze it properly and say, okay, we can tackle it this way or this other way.
Yeah. Would you, by the way, say that was like do you have a favorite tool when it comes to this? You would say
Not
for
at the
people
moment,
to
actually.
check out?
Yeah, I think I still have to check them out. I would love, actually, like, if anyone has like recommendations on checking them out, like, I would love to. Yeah.
Oh, then, by the way, for all listeners, if you know a good AI tool, you consider, by the way, is it best for people if they have questions for you to contact you through LinkedIn or Instagram?
Yeah, LinkedIn works best for me. Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, so if anyone has a favorite AI tool in law or cybersecurity, please send it to Paulina. She'd be very happy to have a look at it.
Yes. Thank you.
By the way, I want to thank you so much for being on the show, AI Insights, and sharing a bit about your journey, how you went from international law into cybersecurity into the world of AI because of your passion for it and also curiosity. And for all our listeners, thank you so much for joining in on an episode of AI Insights here with our guest, Paulina. And thank you all for listening with me. And I hope to see you guys next time on our next episode. So, this is Fleur Prince checking out. See you next time. Stay AI curious.
Thank you.